why does one artwork rather than another end up in a museum? You can interpret that question any way you like, but talk to a neighbor about that. How or why does one artwork as opposed to a different one end up in a museum? Yeah, okay, wonderful. So as we collect these different answers, you can sense already some of the tensions of where power lies in the decision of how an artwork ends up in a museum and why it's a particular artwork, right? Is it because of the universality or the novelty or the ability to trade in symbols from the artist, that's something so eccentrically novel or traditionally talented that makes the artists rise to the top? Or is it a matter of institutions thinking about their budgets, thinking about their audience, thinking about their particular exhibitions that fundamentally matters? Well, here's one reflection on the relationship between an artwork and a museum that you will recognize from the Futurist Manifesto, that what museums are actually is sites of tombs for artworks. That museums are cemeteries where artworks go to die. That's F.T. Marinetti's perspective on museums. And now I will show you, as rebellion against that, an utterly vital, deathless work of futurism that could never be turned into such a tombstone, Umberto Boccioni's Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. It is so dynamic that it has broken its pedestal in two and seems to be striding forward and leaving vapor trails behind. It embodies the aesthetic of speed, of machinery, of the gleam of modernity that you would expect from the Manifesto. And so it would never end up in a museum, right? Oh no, here it is, not only in a museum, but being sketched by posh kids in New York who are further rendering it toothless for a class art exercise as a fun novelty of the local museum. Okay, so what does this mean? This is going to be the big question that animates the whole lecture. How did futurism end up in the institution that it wanted to destroy, in the institution that it thought was anathema to its movement? And does this mean that futurism failed, or by nature of the way the kids are looking up to this statue, does it mean in a perverse way that it succeeded? That's going to be the question we come back to at the end of the lecture. One way of formulating this question comes from a major theorist of the avant-garde, Peter Bürger, who writes that this paradox is the paradox of the failure of the avant-gardes, which lies without a doubt in their artistic success. What are we supposed to make of that? The provocation that was supposed to expose the institution of art, saying that it's a cemetery, is instead recognized by the institution as art. Bürger calls this musealization, taking artwork that was supposed to be independent and free, and in fact thumbing its nose at museums, and that then becomes musealized, that gets moved into the institution it was trying to take down. So this is what we're going to be talking today, and thanks so much for the comment from the back in this regard. This is going to be our major theme. Where does art exist at the nexus of revolution and institution? Or if you prefer, novelty and tradition, or maybe more simply, breaking the rules and making the rules. These are two common ways of thinking about what makes art valuable and what might make one artwork rather than another end up in a gallery. Either because that artwork is so novel that we haven't seen anything like it before, or because it gets approval, fundamentally, because it meets the tastes and demands of the governing body that is going to be hanging it. All of this, I think, poses, as I will say, as a kind of simmering subtext for this lecture, maybe an interesting challenge to you as SLE students. If you joined this program, chances are you have a kind of penchant for the past. You like studying it, you like spending time in libraries and museums, you have a kind of fondness for those institutions, and maybe Marinetti puts us on the defensive about what those institutions represent. And if instead you are all rah-rah for the revolution on the side of this competition, you might think about other challenges that this lecture is going to pose for you, which is why does revolutionary art that seems liberatory sometimes end up aligned with very nefarious politics and other kinds of institutions that are distasteful, and with other kinds of views that are distasteful. We may not have looked much at art history in SLE, if I remember the curriculum well, since the Renaissance painting paper, but I think the discussion that we are going to have today will illuminate what you were doing when you were writing those essays. So tell me if this sounds familiar. On the one hand, you saw one of these paintings and you thought, okay, I'm going to do a bunch of research and I'm going to learn how this painting exists within certain traditions, right? Like maybe the allegory of painting is an existing genre that this woman is working within. Or maybe this is using Christian and classical iconography and combining them in an interesting way. Or maybe it's quoting from Ovid and like it's belonging in that way to a corpus, to a tradition. On the other hand, you were saying to yourself, well, if I want to have, you know, a sexy, fun thesis, I'm going to say, yes, it was playing with those traditions, but it was doing so as to subvert them, right? This was secretly feminist. This was secretly, you know, anti-New World exploration. This was secretly anti-Medici family, even though they were paying for the painting, right? These ideas started to bubble up in those arguments in those papers, and in fact, the kind of grist of the kind of excitement of writing your thesis came from maybe that competition. There is an implicit preference, I think, in our thinking here that we should value art that is somehow new, subversive, daring, difficult, critical, in other words, revolutionary, over art that seems merely to be fitting the rules of what institutions expect of them. And an argument that I'm going to make today is that this very mode of thinking that many of you probably used without even maybe considering it, you know, or maybe being pushed into it by your section leaders, is one that has been projected backward by the 20th and 21st centuries onto even the Renaissance, right? That we have to assume that art has to make a decision between institution and revolution, and we should value the revolutionary. That itself is perhaps a discourse created by the avant-garde that we now apply backward in time. That's one of the things that I think is at stake in kind of understanding this generation of art. Okay, so here's my manifesto. We are going to cover five big questions. Where did the avant-garde come from? Why did it have so many enemies? Why did it write in manifestos as a genre? What kind of revolution did it actually want? In other words, what were its politics? And how ultimately did it end up in a museum? And when you see numbers appear on the top right of the screen, I will remind you that we are moving through these 5 parts of the lecture. Okay, so question 1, where did the avant-garde come from? Let's jump here from the Renaissance to the 19th century and give ourselves some cultural context. So after the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, as you know, you're thinking about Marx, you're thinking about Rousseau, perhaps. There is a new ruling class, and what is that ruling class's culture? What is to their taste? Well, things like marriage plot novels, entertaining operettas, decorative arts that one purchases for the home, and the emergence of the museum itself. The public museum is something that is not just a matter of private collections, but is accessible at least for a kind of slightly wider population body in increasingly democratic societies, with the aristocracy having been taken down a peg. In other words, art that the bourgeois family can enjoy. Here's an example of such a bourgeois family depicted by Edgar Degas. To some artists, as you might suspect by this, of this not exactly happy-looking family, where they're all kind of looking in different directions. The dad's kind of busy. The mom is got a 1,000-yard stare. Artists are looking in at these bourgeois households and saying, man, they do not look super content with ruling the world. And the things they have taste for, the things they are filling their rooms with, the rugs, the clocks, the barometers, the little drawings that are in gilt frames, these things are not really what I want my art to be, even if they are primarily the market for who I can sell to or who will give me a commission. Karl Marx has an even more sinister interpretation of what's going on with bourgeois art. You may remember this quote from the Communist Manifesto. That culture is, for the enormous majority, a mere training to act as a machine. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property. So, bourgeois art for Marx is a factory product, nothing more inspiring or creative than that, and one built to replicate complacent workers. That's the machine at work already in the 19th century. So how would you resist this if you were an artist like Degas or an artist who wanted to be, who wanted to break this commercial mold? Where else could you flee to as an artist? Where else could you go? 3 solutions arise. One is academicism, so turning to classical standards. You could use the privilege of a higher level of knowledge, and you could turn to older pre-bourgeois tradition, or maybe aristocratic tastes and markets that might still exist. This is the standard of art academies and national academies that exist during this time and are in fact at their height in the 19th century as a kind of enclave of something more timeless, something a little older, something that's not subject as much to the whims of commercial tastes of this new bourgeois class. And their slogan might be something like "à l'immortalité," to immortality. Then you have what we might call aestheticism. Make art that is fundamentally about art. It's hard to do this for commercial gain, and it's hard to get into the established salons or academies with this kind of art, but you are communicating something philosophical, something aesthetic, something that's of interest to people who are really in the know among critics and among other artists, as in this painting by Manet that's kind of making fun of conventions of the nude and maybe making fun of bourgeois picnics and playing up sort of like what is happening to art in our own time. Did you all read Flaubert this year? No, okay, never mind. All right, so we might say the slogan here is probably the most famous of the three that you're going to see. Art for art's sake kind of grows out of this particular movement. And then I'm going to give you another one, and you might not think that an artwork from the 1860s could shock you, could be more, any more radical or surprising or departure than these two. But then you see this. And we have a whole host of movements that are trying to find something that is more out there, more in your face, more shocking. Realism is a name for one of those movements. There's also symbolism, decadence, naturalism, all kinds of other small 19th century art movements that are in one way or another trying to shock the bourgeoisie. So take the war to the bourgeoisie directly, not evade them. When you have a painting like this that is showing what it does, but is also titled "The Origin of the World," the superficial shock is also paired with a deeper provocation, right? This work is obscene, but it's also profane. It's also making fun of the sort of Christian values of the ruling class. Okay, now these three movements in the 19th century, I'm going to say, are going to evolve in the 20th century in basic terms into what I call the Old Guard. That's not a universally accepted term, but I think it's a perfectly fine catch-all. Modernism, which you're going to experience in more depth next week when you get into Virginia Woolf and Clarice Lispector, and the Avant-Garde, which is our subject today. And Marinetti rewrites the old battle cry of shock the bourgeoisie with a phrase like, "Are you astounded? Of course you are," he says to the bourgeoisie, because you can't even recall having been alive, right? He's taking his cry at the bourgeoisie as much in the 20th century as these folks were in the 19th. So as we start to draw a schema for 20th century culture, we move to question 2. Why did the avant-garde have so many enemies? And this relates to the term avant-garde itself. So literally, avant-garde means the vanguard, right? The front ranks of a military force. And Marinetti uses this military metaphor explicitly in the Futurist Manifesto when he writes, we alone were still awake and upright, like forward sentries facing an army of enemy stars. So there you get this idea of sort of like a militant artistic group that has an idea of an adversary. Right? The avant-garde wants to do more than offend bourgeois sensibilities. It wants to attack the institutions of bourgeois culture, and that means it is at war with other artists. Okay, what about the war with the old guard then? Here's an example of this first point of attack. On the right, we have a sculpture known as the Toilette de Vénus, which is to say Venus bathing. On the left, I've made a little bit of a pun, and we have a literal toilet. What's happening here? The avant-garde is defining itself first and foremost against the old guard. That's its kind of primary enemy, I would say. It's one of several really important ones. Against traditional, institutional, academic art. I'm hoping that will clarify some of the positions you read about in the manifestos. So whereas the old guard is all about excelling within the rules that are set by the academy, that are set by prize committees or what have you, and do so by way of promoting harmony and idealism in a timeless way that kind of harkens back to classical proportion or classical unities. The avant-garde wants to succeed by having public stunts that result in scandals, right? Like trying to smuggle this urinal into a gallery and then writing a whole article about it when it gets refused. And they do this so as to shock sensibilities, but also so as to ironize, so as to satirize the kinds of things that are making it into exhibitions. Here's Marinetti thinking about this exact exhibition. He does this, of course, throughout the manifesto when he writes, "Do you wish to waste your best strength in this eternal and useless admiration of the past?" I hope you gasped as a SLE student when you read that particular line. Okay, so one enemy, right? The old guard. Now, I'm still going to say, though, that by nature of the old guard and the avant-garde both being invested, as is modernism, in pursuing ideas, in having a kind of fundamental idea-driven aesthetic or ethos, they nevertheless both belong to a tier of culture that we can call the highbrow. And the highbrow as a whole is itself at odds with bourgeois culture and a new popular mass culture. So now we have to think about how the avant-garde goes to war with the middle brow. It is fighting a war on this front too. So not only against the old guard, but against the new version of bourgeois art. Here's an opposition we can think about in this regard. On the top, we have a surrealist artwork called Object. And on the bottom, we have a teacup that is a literal object. And the reason I put these two up against each other is not that they were exhibited side by side, but that there is a strong sense among the avant-garde that what has gone wrong with art, and specifically with middle-brow bourgeois commercial art, is that art has become decorative, and art's job instead is to be provocative. Art is not made to beautify your middle-class home, it is made to challenge you, right? There should be something unsettling, psychologically, unconsciously, I know today is Freud Day, maybe even erotically, about the art object on the top that the Art Deco object on the bottom is simply not doing. Merritt Oppenheim, who created the object on the top, in fact said art has to do with spirit, not with decoration. And if you want another kind of artist of this generation speaking on the same terms, you can think of Picasso, who says, no, painting is not made to decorate apartments. It's an offensive and defensive weapon against the enemy. Again, that's sort of military language, right? Okay, ways of thinking about this. The avant-garde wants to shock bourgeois sensibilities. We've gone over that. It wants to turn commercial objects into art, whereas middlebrow, the manifestation of bourgeois art of the 20th century is about beautifying the bourgeois home and turning art into commercial objects. Finding trendy things that are going on in aesthetics and turning them into something you can mass produce. You may remember this moment from the Futurist Manifesto, where I think Marinetti is playing with this idea when his car gets wrecked, his luxurious car gets wrecked, and it becomes instead a beautiful shark, as he describes it. And he says, the car slowly emerged from the ditch, leaving behind in its depths its heavy chassis of good sense and its soft upholstery of comfort. So we're stripping out everything that makes this a luxury commercial item and turning it into a pure machine. That's the kind of futurist move away from the middle brow. Okay, finally, we add the lowbrow. This would be a whole separate conversation. The lowbrow we can conceive of as art that is created for the masses, but also art that wells up from within the masses. So there is kind of mass culture, which we might think of as kind of coming from below, well, as sort of imposed from, as imposed from above, popular culture that is sort of coming from below. You can also think of folk culture as something that comes from within the masses. Interestingly, as we'll see in a moment, artists of the highbrow sometimes want to align themselves with the artists of the lowbrow because they want that large attention, and really that they're not as much at war with them as they are with the old guard and the middle brow. In any case, so we remember that we're fighting a war on two fronts, right? And Marinetti generally puts this, perhaps, as in the phrase, there is no beauty that does not consist of struggle. And I think struggle is a key term in Spring Quarter for SLE. Virtually every philosopher you've been reading up through these weeks has some version of class struggle or racial struggle or personal struggle or generational struggle. And the avant-garde is very much invested in that rhetoric. Now, lest you think I am making all this up about all of these brows and this schema and there being these names for different categories of art and whatnot, there actually was a very explicit battle of the brows happening in print media and on the radio in this period. And Virginia Woolf, who we now call a modernist and you're going to learn more about next week, and I will lecture on her too, so please come back for that, takes her own shots in a letter she wrote about the brows in this final line. And she says, if any human being, man, woman, dog, cat, or half-crushed worm dares call me middlebrow, I will take my pen and stab him dead. Why? Why so vehemently against the middlebrow as opposed to some of these other categories? Well, Woolf considers the lowbrow honest and authentic, whereas she considers the middlebrow wishy-washy. For herself, she is proud to be called a highbrow, which she considers to be working in the pursuit of ideas. And we might ask, why is Woolf so concerned with being called middlebrow, apart from it just being like the mass of commercial art that's not really doing anything interesting? this raises for me, I think, the problem of what's going on with women's status with regard to the highbrow and the avant-garde, and the misogyny that you surely noticed when you were reading the Futurist Manifesto. So if you remember, Marinetti writes explicitly about Futurism having a contempt for women and a contempt for feminism, right? And I think what's going on here in the avant-garde, in part, is that Marinetti is dismissing women's art and the female audience because he sees it as middlebrow. He thinks like, okay, what was this family art of the 19th century that has evolved into middlebrow novels and theater and movies and what have you in the 20th century? It must be driven by this sort of new class of women scriveners and women theater goers, right? That's not explicitly on the page, but I think that's one of the things that's going on, and that's pretty typical, unfortunately, of what many highbrow critics think of women artists and their audience. But it's very important to say that women are very much at the forefront of the vanguard that is the avant-garde, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. Okay, so the avant-garde is at war with the old guard, it's at war with the middlebrow, it's at war with the bourgeoisie, and maybe it's at war with women at some level. Putting this all together, how does it help us read into a poem that Marinetti or Breton actually wrote, if you want to call these poems? I don't know, Marinetti called the first one Words in Freedom, so he had his own generic category for what he thought he was doing here. So let's start with that one. So Marinetti composes this Words in Freedom, this poem, this artwork, however you want to think about it, titled, "In the evening, lying on her bed, she reread the letter from her artilleryman at the front." And you note that this is composed around 1917 to 1919, around the end of World War I. Take a moment. What do you think is going on in this work? Based on everything I've kind of given you about the avant-garde, where is Marinetti picking fights here? In what way is this an avant-garde artwork on the left? Yeah.
Like a literary discourse.
If we think about the Romantics perhaps or a whole tradition of lyric, perhaps maybe the sonnets are even a better example. The tradition of poetry in the West has been so much about composing in calmness and stillness what was a kind of highly charged, maybe emotional initial impression. But here, a word like esplosione, of explosion, is not just describing what the poem is about. It is literally what's happening to the words and components. Yeah. Interesting. I've never thought about this before, but in a war poem where she is imagining, right? She's got an artilleryman boyfriend, something along those lines, who's at the front, who's experiencing real war. Interesting that he has kind of amputated her own form as she's listening to this and reading this. Yeah, funny. What else do we think about? What else do we think about her form and her role in this painting, or the painting collage? So we're intruding into a woman's private place. We might even think of her as a different modern version of a female nude. It doesn't seem like she's clothed necessarily. And we're intruding even into her private thoughts, right? She's thinking about and reading this description of the front, but presumably this is not what her artilleryman actually wrote to her. He didn't write, "Grag, track, she," like she's imagining what he's actually going through as he's fighting World War I and kind of projecting herself onto the front, into the war, and maybe even becoming, in her own right, a futurista. Like, we don't know exactly why that word is there, but the name of the movement is in the image. Okay, let's talk about the Breton picture a little bit. I mean, maybe we can summarize and just say that we have here a kind of making fun of, or revision of, or update to the figure of the female nude who's being now drawn into a kind of militarized, masculinized, futurist aesthetic. So it's kind of taking shots at the old guard, taking shots at the feminine middlebrow, perhaps in various ways. Now let's think about the Madame that shows up in the other poem. So I've given you the French here, but you've read it in English. You just maybe won't recognize it yet. I'll just read it in French so you understand that this poem is not quite as random as it originally sounds and seems. So here it goes. Un éclat de rire de saphir dans l'île de Ceylan, les plus belles pailles ont le teint fané sous les verrous dans une ferme isolée. Au jour le jour s'aggrave l'agréable, une voix carrossable vous conduit au bord de l'inconnu, le café prêche pour son sein. L'artisan quotidien de votre beauté, madame, une paire de bas de soie n'est pas un saut dans le vide, un cerf. So the only reason I read that to you in French is not to show off my elementary school education, but because I want you to feel that there is some alliteration, some internal rhyme scheme. What's happened here, I mean, what has Breton made that out of? Like, what has he done here, like physically? Yeah, probably headlines. What other parts of newspapers do you think or magazines is he drawing on?
Advertisements.
Advertisements. Why do you say advertisements?
French.
Yeah, but even at a glimpse, because of the typography, because of some of the words, you can tell that like, oh, this stuff about beauty, about addressing a madam, as it happens, in fact, talking to a madam about a pair of silk stockings, all this suggests that he's also specifically going after the advertising space. So he's taking this design work, if we can call it that, that is meant to be commercial, that is meant to sell something, and turning it into a useless art object, but saying that that's the nobler experiment, right? Madam, the pair of silk stockings that this magazine was initially going to send you to buy is not a leap into space, is not what these words, not what this language, not what French is capable of doing to you, not what Surrealism is capable of doing to you, right? But just in general, with all the things that we've already said, right, playing with the format of lyric poetry by not actually composing anything personal, not composing anything that comes from himself, but rather an association of things that he's cut out. He has taken this, commercial culture, this trash, in fact, the newspaper, the magazine that's going to get thrown away, and it's certainly going to be thrown away when it's cut into strips, and he's turned it, he thinks, hopefully, into something, sort of elevating, redemptive, that provokes your imagination, that provokes some thoughtfulness. Okay, now, I've given you two poems, but it's worth saying that the most memorable form of literary expression of the avant-garde is not, in fact, its poetry, it is the manifesto itself. So here we get to question 3, which is, why did the avant-garde write in manifestos? And the simple answer to this is the specter haunting Europe and haunting European art, that is Karl Marx. Right? In the 20th century, the old guard and the avant-garde start to get invested in what Marx really cared about philosophically, which was praxis, trying to change the world. So if you remember, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, from your Marx reading, for philosophers, the point is not to interpret the world, the point is to change it. Similarly, for artists now, the point is not merely to describe the world, to render it realistically, the point is to change the world. And that is why somebody like Marinetti will write a sentence like, seize your pickaxes, axes, and hammers. Those are not paintbrushes and chisels, right? Those are different kinds of tools for different kinds of work. Meanwhile, the manifesto for the artist is also supposed to propagate around the world. Rather than maybe workers of the world, this is a rallying cry to artists of the world to unite around a new program. It is from Italy that we are flinging this to the world, Marinetti writes. Yes, we have a kind of national and local community point of origin, but we want this to be a global movement as much as communism is supposed to be. And this is supposed to be programmatic. It's supposed to be easy to follow for audiences and artists who want to jump on board. So we have a platform, we are going to list it out to you. This is sort of the origin of the listicle. We, still fearless, have dictated our first intentions, Marinetti says, and then he goes into enumerating what the principles of futurism will be. All in all, what this means is that the manifesto as a genre, when you put all these things together, is about collective production and collective reception. Marinetti puts it like this: we shall sing the multicolored and polyphonic tidal waves of revolution in the modern metropolis. In other words, he wants collaborators in this mission. And this was incredibly successful. It accounts for an explosion of artistic isms over the next 10 to 20 years across various territories in Europe and beyond. We have Expressionism in Germany, we have Fauvism in France, we have Cubism coming from Spanish artists, we have De Stijl in the Netherlands, we have Orphism also in France, we have Suprematism in Russia, we have the Mexican public mural movement, we have Dada taking off from Switzerland and trying to make it globally. All of these movements kind of write manifestos for themselves. Sometimes they are named by critics, but they follow this idea of praxis, propagation, and program, I would say. Above all, what the manifesto is a recipe for more manifestos. By 1914, Marinetti could already publish a whole book of futurist manifestos, and it became its own literary genre to the point that, as some critics have said, it becomes the very content of futurism, the content of the avant-garde. And that's why we assign you the manifestos in SLE rather than the poems or the artworks. The manifesto is kind of the important artistic innovation. The manifesto takes Marx's vehicle for political statement and it turns it into a form of poetry. But that political origin is still relevant. And so here I'm going to turn to question 4. What kind of political revolution did the avant-garde want? Among all the movements and manifestos we could have given you, SLE has focused on the Futurists and Surrealists for a particular reason, I think. And that's because these two movements took their political objectives the most seriously and in completely opposite directions. So the Futurists, as you might have suspected from the rhetoric, even in 1909, become linked with Italian fascism. The emphasis on militarization, on masculinity, on violence, on modernization inspires Mussolini's early ideas and his postures. Mussolini called himself at heart a futurist, and Marinetti helped him co-write this fascist manifesto in 1919, and then he spoke with Mussolini at rallies and even led some men on raids. Now, over time, Marinetti has an uneasy relationship with fascism. They come to kind of distrust each other, but futurist artists beyond Marinetti continue to celebrate Mussolini and his movement in the 20s and 30s and try to glorify him. Meanwhile, André Breton, the lead surrealist, reorients within a year his aesthetic revolution around the goal of socialist revolution, and he banishes all surrealists who refuse to participate in communist collective action. Like Marinetti, he quickly clashes with the actual political leadership. The French Communist Party doesn't really know what to do with a bunch of surrealists. But anyway, that's a different story. And so Breton goes international, and he meets with Leon Trotsky and Diego Rivera, and they write a manifesto for an independent revolutionary art that's anti-Stalinist, but still trying to find a role for an international communist art. I'm moving through this very quickly, but one person who will help you think through it is this cultural critic, Walter Benjamin, who we sometimes assign in SLE, who in the middle of the 1930s writes an essay about the intersection of the arts, technology, and politics called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. If you want to go read that on your own because it's related to your spring paper or just because you're curious and you need some guidance, please do that and then email me. I've done a whole reconstruction of that essay. I've done a whole lecture for another program on that essay. So a quick summary or a glimpse, a snapshot. I told you a story about, at the beginning of this lecture, about how the avant-garde and the old guard were formed as different reactions against middle-brow bourgeois art. And I'm sticking to that, but Benjamin adds something to this story. For him, the important flashpoint is the creation of these different camps is the invention of photography and our ability now to mechanically reproduce art. Because what happens with photography is it undermines an old ritual power, an aura that artwork used to have. And in that moment, some artists cling to the old rituals and the old aura when art almost had a kind of theological importance. So some artists go to that art for art's sake direction, and they say, individual artworks still matter. You can't always, reproduce them. Individual experiences with artworks can be really sublime and are a way of escaping modernity. Let's turn back to that. But a new set of artists realizes that the game is up and decides to chuck the idea of old art rituals aside and instead try to gather big crowds around experimental political stunts with works of satire, film projects, and attacks on institutions. And so for them, the solution to the crisis in art is to flee artistic tradition and find a new purpose in politics, a turn to politics, a turn to the stunt or the scandal. In his famous epilogue, if you only read one thing from Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, read this. In his famous epilogue to the essay, Benjamin writes about the revolutionary political alliance of Futurism and Fascism in particular, as one of these turns to politics. And Benjamin argues that fascism and futurism take advantage of the unrest of the masses and the surplus of modern technology that occurs under capitalism, and instead of changing the political system, what they do is they just give those masses an expressive outlet. And that expressive outlet is war itself. You have to remember he's writing this in the 30s in the aftermath of World War I and also looking ahead to new mobilization in Germany. And all this leads to a new slogan for modern art, according to Benjamin. Not one that's ever explicitly stated, but one that is more accurate, which is fiat ars pereat mundus, or let art be created though the world perish. This, Benjamin claims, is evidently the consummation of art for art's sake. So, a distinct, a sinister version of the 19th century aesthetic movement, when all you care about is expression, and you want to mobilize as many people behind it as possible, this is potentially what you get. Now, previously distinct categories are starting to get muddled here in the schemas that we've been creating, right? Under fascism, the ritual aura of pure art and the modern mechanization of futurist militarism are getting synthesized. And Benjamin seems to strain, I think, a little bit at this point in this essay to keep his own categories coherent. But here, in the final lines, he makes this distinction. Such is the aestheticizing or aestheticization of politics as practiced by fascism. Communism responds by politicizing art. So Benjamin, being a Marxist, wants this to mean two different things. Right? One is that fascism absorbs the masses by making the politics of violence and power aesthetically pleasing. Here you might think of a film like Triumph of the Will, a propaganda film, or Nazi uniforms and military parades, putting artistic rituals into political practice. And he hopes that communism will mobilize the masses to a different, higher plane of consciousness by using art to develop their sense of class and a new politics. And here you might think about some SLE films like Battleship Potemkin or Man with a Movie Camera, putting politics into new forms of art that take the intelligence of their audiences seriously. But if you still feel like this distinction is blurry, like is there really a difference between these two different totalitarian modes in terms of how they use art, there might be a reason for that, because after all, when we gotten to this point in history, it seems like our original distinction at the beginning of the lecture between revolution and institution has gotten really blurry, right? Revolution and institution seem to have merged under these totalitarian systems in terms of where the experimental artists are putting their energy. As Benjamin alludes to in this essay, there was a flourishing of political avant-garde art in the early years of the Soviet Union. Russia had its own futurist movement before the 1917 revolution, and that was followed by constructivism, which you might see in Vertov's film, or you might see in this propaganda design image about the Russian Civil War. That aimed to represent Russia as modern and engage a working class audience with abstract utopian designs, something that represented the work of dismantling and rebuilding a political state. But under Stalin, by the time Benjamin is writing, the official communist art style has become socialist realism. There is a retreat to the safety of art that relies on an older, simpler artistic language, a conservative style, clear content, ritual and aura around a charismatic leader or a powerful patron. So the art program of the government has completely flipped. We see something similar happen in Italy. Initially, Mussolini embraces the futurists, but then he pushes them gradually out of the political sphere, and eventually he's more impressed by Nazi neoclassicism. So he decides to go in that direction. And then so Italian fascism ends up embracing the ancient art that the futurists were once railing against. And a pattern is emerging here already in these two examples that totalitarian regimes always do away ultimately with the avant-garde. The energy of revolutionary aesthetics that is initially appealing is too dangerous for actual despots to hold on to for long. And even though the avant-garde art wants to inspire revolutionary thinking in the minds of the masses with its art, this isn't what dictators want, right, in the long run. They don't want a stimulated, intellectually curious mass population. Now, up till now, I've been showing you kind of juxtapositions that I have chosen, but in the case of Nazi Germany, it was the government that put them into juxtaposition themselves, into direct comparison, so actively pitting the avant-garde against state art. In Germany, in the summer of 1937, Hitler and his ministers organized two exhibitions in Munich within a few blocks of each other. The Degenerate Art Exhibition on the left, representing the avant-garde, and the Great German Art Exhibition on the right, representing the old guard. And Hitler gave his own speech before the opening of the Degenerate show, describing a mop-up war that needed to be done against these artworks and against these artists, which was preparing Germany for a human mop-up war against the identities represented in those artworks, right? Bolsheviks, queer people, Jews, those artists represented on the wall are being targeted for their ideas and their artworks and as people, as artists, and as an identity, right? Now, curiously, only a few 100,000 people went to see the Great German Show, whereas 2 million people came to see the Degenerate Show. You can make of that what you will. But one of the consequences was that the Reich Propaganda Directorate decided to take the Degenerate Show on a tour around the country to show everybody these degenerate art with captions explaining why the art was bad, and then they destroyed most of the artworks. Okay, what's going on here with regard to art institutions and political institutions, the old guard and the avant-garde? Here's where we get to our fifth and final question. I know I'm running a little bit long, but we are truly nearing the end. So, the weird thing that has happened here is that the alliances made by the avant-garde and the old guard switch, I think. The old guard, which used to rely on the approval of art institutions, now becomes part of the political establishment. And meanwhile, the avant-garde, which used to want to shape politics, which made the original turn to politics, eventually actually becomes more respected among art institutions. That new alliance, the light blue alliance, gets solidified during the Cold War. Because of the shift in totalitarian tastes in the 30s and 40s, the powers of the West reconceive avant-garde as representing artistic freedom. So working worldwide, the CIA and the covertly funded Congress for Cultural Freedom actively start to promote modernist writers, expressionist painters, jazz musicians, all previously treated as undesirable radicals. now deployed as cultural weapons. And in 1961, MoMA holds a giant Futurism retrospective, solidifying that Futurism now belongs in a museum. And there is our original artwork, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, bringing us back to the beginning of the lecture and our starting question. How exactly did Futurism, the enemy of museums, end up in a museum? Or more broadly, how did the avant-garde and the art institution end in a room together? And we have something of a historical answer now, right? The avant-garde tried to join up with political revolutions around World War I. It was betrayed by those revolutions between the wars as totalitarian regimes got solidified. And then it forged a new, unlikely alliance with cultural institutions in the aftermath of World War II. But in the more conceptual cultural war that was raging, the war between revolution and institution that was supposed to be declared by the futurists, what does this actually mean? Like, who won? So I want to ask you, think for a second. I'm going to ask you who you think is the winner here. Who thinks the art institutions won out over the avant-garde? Only a few people. I'll give you a second. When you see this unique forms of continuity space in the museum, you think, yeah, the museums are the ultimate winner here. Okay, who thinks, okay, so a handful, maybe 10% of the room, maybe 20%. Who thinks this is an avant-garde victory over the museum? A slight majority. Okay, and some people are undecided. Okay, so if you raise your hand on the first one, if you think this is a kind of victory of musealization or of the museum, why? Yeah. So it's maybe not that the museum won, but it does feel like the avant-garde lost. That in a way, to see this radical sculpture in this context feels as though it can't really have ever been that radical, or it's not that radical anymore. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Who else? Who thinks the museums kind of came out on top here? Yeah. Yeah, okay, good. So we are still, the museums are saying we are still the tastemakers. You may have these incendiary manifestos, but ultimately, like, what the public acknowledges that museums are the ones who decide what really counts. Yeah, I really like that. Okay, good. One last thought. Yeah.
The one thing.
Great. This otherwise glittering and pointy sculpture is now completely inert and safe. It's been elevated from any possible risk of doing damage to the psyche or body or butter of the populace. Okay, wonderful. I love that. Okay, good. So maybe this is an institutional victory. One way we might think about this is, and I think some of you were saying this in terms of the absorption that the museum is able to do, and in terms of the taste making that the museum is able to do, is maybe the institutions of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie itself are not so easily shocked. Maybe, in fact, because capitalism loves novelty, they're totally willing to get on board with this avant-garde work and turn it into something that elevates their own prestige, right? Maybe, in fact, the avant-garde was never so much a force trying to destroy capitalism as it was a manifestation of capitalism in its relentless search for novelty, and that's why it kind of synced up with the museum as an institution. One funny example here comes from your film from last week, Un Chien d'Alou, which you might have expected to really disgust people, right, when it got shown in theaters, but actually the bourgeois audience ate it up. They loved it. And the director, Luis Buñuel, was so dismayed by this. He said, "A box office success? But what can I do about those who seek every novelty, even if that novelty outrages their most profoundly held convictions?" That was not what the movie was supposed to do. It wasn't supposed to be a runaway hit with the people I was trying to disgust and offend. Okay, now I want to hear from the other camp. Who thinks the avant-garde kind of scored an upset here? Yeah. Okay, good. So the avant-garde was always meant to be ephemeral and have its effect as a kind of stunt in the moment. And the fact that a museum later recognizes the historical significance of that stunt doesn't mean that they lost any power. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah, great. Who else? Who else thinks the avant-garde came out with a victory here? Yeah. So many great points here, one of which is clearly the kind of underlying thesis that the museum recognizes the importance of the new. And I think something you mentioned in passing is the fact that there is a caption explaining what the artwork does. And that's something we could read as an institutional victory of like, okay, the museum's going to explain what the avant-garde artwork was doing and therefore kind of spin the narrative in terms of, describing why the museum thinks the artwork is important rather than the artist. But the fact that the language of that placard is almost certainly going to draw upon the ideas of the manifestos means the avant-garde has fully infiltrated, right? It is in that way calling the shots of like what is deemed important, and the curators engineers, the docents, the critics who are in charge of writing about the art are probably ingesting what the manifestos said about the art and then spitting it back, right? Okay, good. So this could be an avant-garde victory. Maybe the avant-garde fundamentally changed the rules of what we should value in art, and that institutions and audiences then followed their lead. The old guard used to dictate the rules through academies, but once the old guard got co-opted by totalitarianism, it looked like those values might be bankrupt or empty. And so in the wake of World War II and with the rise of the Cold War, the avant-garde started to look like the art of freedom, the art of individualism, the art of resistance, and therefore, and museums recognized that and were willing to suddenly exhibit and celebrate that art. So now when we go into a museum, as Bürger argues, the discourse of the institution has been molded. It's molded by the avant-garde to a degree that no one could have predicted. Avant-garde categories such as rupture and shock gained admittance to the discourse of art. And that is a major legacy for the avant-garde. It made novelty, innovation, and experimentation the highest goals of the form. Now I recognize I'm like blowing through my Q&A time, but I have just one little button to end on that I think you'll appreciate as SLE students, and then we can continue to do questions as a group or up at the podium or what have you. But let me leave you with this. There is one more possibility here on the matter of who beat whom or who ultimately achieved victory. I'm going to say victory with a capital V. You'll understand why in a moment. I want to give you one final relevant quote from the Futurist Manifesto and one final look at the Boccioni sculpture. So here's one other quote from Marinetti. "A racing car with a hood that glistens, that is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." Okay, here again is Boccioni's sculpture, and here is the victory of Samothrace. And I think when you see these sculptures together, you can tell that Boccioni is trying to be a good futurist and do something new, right? He's trying to create something that's like a racing car, that feels, gold and chrome and shiny and dynamic and what have you, but he's also paying homage against Marinetti to something very old, to the exact work of art that Marinetti denigrated in the Manifesto. And there's a lesson here that the art that succeeds much of the time, that makes it into the museum or just that makes it into our kind of universal consciousness, is the art that strikes a balance between the old and the new, between revolution and tradition. Marinetti may have called for the destruction of the past, but the artists of his movement and so many other artists of his period, including Boccioni, saw the value of the past and wanted not just to destroy it, but to renovate it. We can turn here at the end to one last manifesto, if we can call it that, an essay by the poet T.S. Eliot, written in 1919, a preview of your turn to modernism next week. As a modernist, Eliot was torn between avant-garde techniques and old-guard ideas. He's someone who wrote very radical free verse poetry, but also very conservative essays. And the title of this essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, gives you a sense of that duality and that tension, right? There's the tradition that Eliot cares so much about, of belonging to a conversation with other poets across time, but there's also individual eccentricity that is taking off with new poetry in the 20th century. And here's what Eliot writes about the old and the new. He says, no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, parentheses, the really new, work of art among them. That's kind of a shot at the avant-garde, I think. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is the conformity between the old and the new. So that's the idea I want to leave you with as a way of thinking about your own creative work and maybe about the SLE syllabus too. For better or worse, you have been in a program this whole year that has given you a kind of ideal order of monuments, right, of dead poets and artists. And you can choose to venerate that order, like the old guard or the aestheticists. You can choose to try to destroy that order, as Marinetti calls for, or you can create something like Boccioni's sculpture, what Eliot calls the really new work of art, a statue, a poem, maybe even an essay that knows what came before and does something that changes what it means. Okay, that's the end.